There is something unusual and weird going on with Charles Johnson. Because how does this man have a win over current UFC flyweight champion Joshua Van and Lonnie Kavanagh, but also loses to Cody Durden? Let's talk about it. Charles Johnson is an enigma of the flyweight division, reminiscent of a lightweight Michael Johnson with wins over Dustin Poirier, Tony Ferguson, Edson Barboza, but then also loses to unranked fighters. And with all of these wins and losses happening in his prime. So I'm sure most of us have seen the memes about how getting slimed out by Charles Johnson is the best base for MMA in the flyweight division. So let's look a little bit deeper into his record. Just for some context before we get into this, Charles Johnson has a record of 8-6 in the UFC with an overall record of 19-8. So Joshua Van definitely had some hype surrounding him going into his fight with Charles Johnson. He was 3-0 in the UFC with an overall record of 10-1, and his only pro loss came by submission in his third pro fight. And if you know anything about Joshua Van, his base is purely striking. He's talked about how he didn't really start learning grappling until just a few months before his UFC debut. In his fight with Charles Johnson, the first 2 rounds were pretty close. Neither fighter really had huge moments, but it looked like Joshua Van was landing the slightly more damaging shots. It was in the 3rd round, though, when Johnson landed a clean uppercut that snapped Van's head straight back and dropped him. The ref stopped the fight pretty much immediately. I will say the stoppage might have been a tad early because Van wasn't fully out, and it looked like he hit the canvas and came right back up to potentially grab some legs and start wrestling up and recovering and potentially survive, but the ref stopped it right away. And I will say, he did get dropped pretty bad. Interesting thing, though, is that after that loss to Johnson, Joshua Van put together 5 straight wins and earned himself a title shot. We all know what happened after that. So this is the first piece of evidence I'm submitting for losing to Charles Johnson being the best thing for your career. Now, let's talk about Lonnie Kavanagh. Kavanagh was undefeated, 9-0 going into his fight with Charles Johnson. People were really excited about him. He had a lot of hype, and he was considered a real prospect, likely to be fighting for the title one day. Now, let's talk about what happened in this fight. So the first round was all Kavanagh. He was much more active than Johnson and landed some heavy strikes that definitely hurt him a couple times. But in the second round, the tide kind of turned. Early in the round, it was still relatively even, but then Johnson started finding his groove and finding success with pushing Kavanagh to the fence with his pressure and then landing some big shots there. This is what ultimately led to the finish, a beautiful right hand by Johnson while Kavanagh was moving backwards that knocked him out clean. Now the real question is, what did Kavanagh do after that loss? Well, 6 months after the loss, he stepped in on short notice to face Brandon Moreno. Former flyweight champion Brandon Moreno, by the way. Kavanagh really shocked the world with this one because this ended up being a pretty dominant, unanimous decision victory for Kavanagh. And now Kavanagh has just been booked to fight Brandon Royval at International Fight Week. Royval is right now 4th in the flyweight rankings. So I think I've provided some compelling evidence as to how getting slimed out by Charles Johnson seems to skyrocket your career. But we all already knew that. Now I want to talk about the other side of this funky business around Charles Johnson. While losing to Charles Johnson seems to put you in line for a title shot, beating Charles Johnson seems to do the opposite to your career. This is the curse of Charles Johnson. So Johnson's first loss in the UFC was to Muhammad Mokaev. Now, where is Mokaev in the title picture today? Well, Mokaev's not in the UFC anymore. He was released. He was cut because allegedly he was a boring fighter that the fans didn't really connect with. And also, allegedly, he was a difficult person for the UFC to work with, like on the business side of things. But what I'm suggesting is this may be the Charles Johnson curse at play. Now, Johnson's next loss in the UFC was against Ode Osbourne. This was a little bit of a controversial decision, by the way, but I feel like that doesn't matter to the curse. Now, Ode Osbourne was 3-3 in the UFC before facing Johnson. He is someone who Johnson probably should have beaten on paper, and Johnson was the betting favorite going into this fight. So Osbourne beats Johnson. What's he up to now? Well, he has gone 1-4-1 in the UFC since beating Johnson. I'm going to repeat that. 1 win, 4 losses since beating Charles Johnson. And overall in the UFC, he is 5-7-1 in the UFC. Cursed. I'm telling you. Johnson also lost his next fight against the one and only Cody Durden. Johnson was also the favorite going into this fight, and Durden won by decision. Since that fight, Cody Durden has been on a bit of a skid. He has won 3 and lost 6 fights since beating Charles Johnson. Some might argue it's because these fighters aren't necessarily UFC caliber, but I feel like it's more fun if it's the curse. Maybe it's the hair, you guys. Maybe it's the skullet. Maybe the skullet is giving Johnson magical powers to win all the fights he's supposed to lose and lose all the fights he's supposed to win. Maybe magic has to have a balance or something like that. Anyways, Charles Johnson is facing a pretty hyped up prospect this weekend, Asu Almabayev. Almabayev has a record of 23-3, and his only loss in the UFC came against Manel Kopp after Kopp tried to remove his eyes with his fingers. The eye pokes were disgusting and definitely affected the fight, and in my opinion, led to the finish. So Almabayev isn't necessarily the most hyped up prospect right now, but he's definitely got some eyes on him. And in my opinion, if he wants to make it to the title anytime soon, he's got to do it. He's got to get slimed out by Charles Johnson. Let me know which direction you think the Charles Johnson skullet curse is going to play out this weekend. And if you watched this far into the video, let me know how much money you would have to get paid to rock the skullet for an entire year. Bye.